Hello, I'm Bruce Renowden and welcome to RBA's August Melbourne Property Scene review. In the August review, we look at how the market has performed in Melbourne, broadly speaking, in the month of July. And we use the auction success rates, a very handy set of statistics which gives us an excellent view into the sentiment around the property market. And I think you're going to find it pretty revealing, a little bit disturbing. The sentiment gauge, if you like, has taken quite a nosedive in the last month or so. And when I give you these figures shortly, you'll see that for yourself. It's not surprising in many ways, given the current environment we've got with interest rates and the economy generally, and the fact that we've had a pretty good market for quite a long time now, but it's mostly interest rate driven, I suspect. But in any event, the reason why I like the success rates at auction as a barometer for the health of the market, been tracking these probably since the mid to late 80s, and I don't think there's any better gauge, a broad gauge across the overall property market than the auction success rate. It's not specific, and the figures themselves aren't exacting. I mean, engineers would hate these figures because they're not accurate figures. But what's good about the auction success figures is that they are, if you like, consistently inconsistent. And I've found nonetheless that over the decades they have provided a very, very close relationship with a gauge to how market sentiment is. And as such, I don't think there's a better gauge to look at. It covers, auction success rates cover a wide range of properties, of course, from flats and townhouses, houses, in all areas of Melbourne, and some auction success rates that are recorded in the figures come from the country as well. But primarily it's a Melbourne-based set of numbers, and gives a very good guide to that. So just before I give you those figures, though, I'd like to break down the success rate just so that you're clear on what the actual figures represent. There's a number of components to the recording of success rates at auction. The obvious one, of course, is properties that are sold under the hammer at auction. So that's a pretty straightforward statistic. They are auction success rates, so a property that's sold under the hammer, whether it's with 2 buyers or 5 buyers, we don't know that information, but the fact that it's sold is a sign that there's sentiment, the sentiment is good, or it's certainly good enough to produce a buyer for that particular property. So given the high numbers of properties that are auctioned in Melbourne being the auction capital basically of, well, everywhere for that matter, worldwide apart from Australia, but the numbers consistently over the years have been very high in Melbourne, subject to seasonal fluctuations, of course, which we'll come to in a sec too, but it gives a very good guide. And it covers a wide range of property types, which is also very useful to get a broad view on how things are travelling. Now, the sales at auctions, as I said, they're the main and obvious component, but you have sales prior to auction, of course, and in quieter markets where it's harder to find a buyer for the selling agent, you'll find more sales take place prior to auction, because they're a bit keener to lock a sale in if they think they've got a good offer and a good buyer on tap, rather than take the chance of going to auction and that buyer buys something else or drops out of the market altogether, because the agent doesn't necessarily have the confidence to believe that they might have multiple buyers by come auction day. So sales prior to auction occur more often in quieter markets. So that's one of the components that goes into auction success rates, but frequently one of the inconsistencies or inaccuracies, if you like, of the figures is that auctions that are sold prior to will just be registered as sales at auction. And the other one, the main one, is properties that are passed in at auction. The buyer may well have attended the auction and may well have bid at the auction, but didn't quite reach the reserve. Property was typically passed into that buyer, and a negotiation took place in the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, and the property was sold. Everyone was still on site. The vendor was on site, the buyers were on site, the agents hadn't left the property. It was all negotiated and signed up within an hour of the auction sale. And a lot of those results, although the auction was technically passed in, a lot of those results will be recorded as auction sales. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about some of the figures, exactly what they represent and how accurate they are. But look, it doesn't matter. I mean, for the purposes of the exercise, which is to gauge the overall market strength, if you can find a buyer that buys it, whether it's before auction, at auction, or 10 minutes after that was at the auction, in a 4-week campaign, or it's actually 4 weekends, most auction campaigns, which is really only about three and a half weeks, really, three to 4 weeks. That's a pretty good result. That shows that sentiment is pretty strong and that the market is generally pretty good. So if you can get a consistently high success rate at auction with those three components that make up the result, and given that those, as I said, those buyers are actually found and put together, and the sales are put together within 3 or 4 weeks, that's a pretty healthy state of affairs. Now, generally, success rates, if the market's going very well, success rates will be between 70 and 80%. In the last 2 decades, we've seen a number of sales results where the success rate is 80% or better. Now, that is exceptional. And the reason it's exceptional is because, well, you might say, well, why, if it's a really exceptional market, why aren't 90 or 95% of properties sold at auction? Well, the reason's pretty straightforward. There are always going to be some properties that just won't sell, that won't attract a buyer, and these have some fairly obvious drawbacks to them. They can be adversely affected by a very noisy main road, or they might be situated next to a factory, or they might be very poorly presented, have an ordinary floor plan, a number of considerations which have a negative impact on the desirability of the property, and those sorts of properties in 3 to 4 weeks, it's a lot harder to find a buyer for them, so they'll be a passed-in statistic. And another consideration which obviously contributes to a pass-in result, you may have had buyers bidding on a property and interested in the place, but you may have had a situation where a vendor was just a bit high on expectations, weren't realistic in what they wanted for their price for their property, and so it was a passed-in result, which we don't know exactly why it was passed in, but nonetheless that's a valid reason why that property or those properties don't come as a sales statistic, when in fact they may have come as a sales statistic. But nonetheless, so you find that if you've got a success rate in the high 70s or 80% or even better, that is an exceptional market. Prices are rising strongly, and to sell that many properties in a short amount of time is pretty impressive. Now, over the last couple of decades, a lot of the time, the success rate has been between 70 and 80%. And that is an impressive set of numbers, and the market is rising when the market has that sort of success rate at auction. Typically though, over the very long term, I mean, as I said, I think I've been tracking these numbers since the mid to late 80s, and a lot of the time during that period, and at other times in the last 2 decades too, the statistics, the success rate has been in the 60s. If it's around 60, the market's, it's pretty, it's cool to lukewarm really. Prices aren't really going anywhere. A lot of properties will still get passed in and be on the private sale market for some time, and need to, and may end up not ever being sold. They might just be withdrawn after 2 months because they couldn't find a buyer. So that's typical of a market where you've got to say a 60% success rate. So once you get below 70, depends where you are in the 60s, high 60s, the market's okay. Low 60s, around 60, it's starting to get pretty tepid. And once you get below 60, you are in a market that is suffering from a fair amount of negative sentiment, and buyers are holding back a lot. Now, the revealing statistics in the last month or two, in July, we had 5 Saturdays in July, 5 weekends in July, and the figures came out between success rates of between 54 and 58% for the 5 weekends. So that is that is a pretty strong indication that sentiment for the property market in Melbourne has really come off the boil. And I would be suggesting that, in my opinion, I suspect that the property prices have quite comfortably across the board dropped 5% already. They may well have dropped more than that for certain types of properties in certain areas, but I would think 5% is pretty safe, and probably somewhere between 5 and 10% depending on property type. Even in June, the market was descending into the 50s. At the beginning of the year, this year, January, February, success rates were still hovering around the 70 mark, which was very healthy. The market started off pretty well this year, even with the war in Ukraine. But interest rates, there's only talk about inflation and so on, and it was all this temporary sort of inflation. So no one was really getting too frightened at that stage by the prospect of interest rates and so forth. But it's only in the last couple of months, really since April, that things have started to move downwards on the success rate. And correspondingly, success at auction, therefore, is harder to find. A lot more properties would be getting passed in. There'd be fewer buyers putting their hand up in the first place. And so you've got this situation where, the herd, when the herd starts to move, it behaves like herds do. Buyers will see what other buyers are doing, and everyone gets a little bit anxious and a little bit more circumspect as to how they conduct themselves. So, and the auction market is very, very indicative of what's happening in the private sale market as well. Although auctions are a small number of sales across Melbourne compared to the total number of sales, they are indicative, very indicative of the overall state of affairs with private sales as well. And something that people don't realise, don't appreciate, is volume does not make really any difference to the success rate at auction. Seasonally, auctions have much higher volumes in autumn and spring. Typically in Melbourne, Melbourne's a very good example because we've been auctioning for forever and a day. But typically in autumn and spring, you'll see between 1,000 and, on a really, really busy Saturday, 1,500 properties scheduled for auction. Now that's a lot of properties. Now if the market is doing very well, if the economic climate is very good, then the success rate will be high. And what's the great contrast here, and what just demonstrates what I've just said as the case, is that we have just had in winter, the month of July, auctions where there were in the order of 500 to 550 auctions scheduled for each Saturday. And those success rates, because the economic climate is suspect, and interest rates are a worry to a lot of people, that success rate is down. So it's not about high volume puts pressure on sales and makes the numbers of successes, brings the number of success down. It's the fact that your garden might look lovely in spring, but if the interest rates are travelling in the wrong direction in spring, the success rate will be down. If the interest rates are travelling well in the middle of July, the success rates will be high, even though there's only 500 sales auction scheduled in July. But the success rate will be down if the converse is true. So as we've got in current winter time, we've got low numbers of offerings, low success rate. Even in autumn this year, where we had up to 1,500 auctions on one weekend, the success rate was still high 60s, around 70. And in years past recently, where the market's been on a tear, what we've found is the success rate has still been up 80% and even higher on some of those really, really busy days. So what's this all saying? Well, basically, when you've got a success rate like this, we need to watch the interest rates, I suspect, and I think that's the main issue with buyer sentiment at the moment. Banks are a bit cautious. Buyers will be cautious, and we'll need to see how that pans out over coming months. I suspect it might stay a little bit like this for a while yet, but we'll see. Time will reveal that. But the last 3 months has seen a considerable decrease in sentiment. Now look, if you're getting any value out of this video, I'd love you just to put a little like down there, give it a like, and maybe leave a comment just to say, hey Bruce, like the video, thanks very much. That would be great. It's really helpful, helps YouTube recognise that people have engaged with this video, and and if they think that, they'll pass it on to other people to see. So I'd be really happy if you'd do that, and thank you for that. Look, this is a monthly review. We'll do this review each month, and if you'd like to be a subscriber, please hit the bell on the subscribe button, and you'll receive these reviews pretty much automatically. So look, thanks for joining us. It's been the market's heading in a bit of a downturn at the moment. Hopefully it won't be forever, but and long term markets are good. History tells us that's good, but at the moment we're heading into a quiet period. So thanks for joining us, and from Renowden Buyers Advocates, we'll see you next time. Thank you.